Welcome to the Deep Dive Books channel, where we hope you find something valuable every day.
Let's continue discussing Malcolm Gladwell's Revenge of the Tipping Point. This is the fourth part of our interpretation. In the previous session, we introduced the magic third rule, which states that, when a minority group within a community reaches a proportion of about 1/4 to 1/3, they can decisively influence the culture of the entire group. If you don't accept this cultural shift, your only option might be to leave. This brings up the question of whether to engage in social engineering. If you want to preserve a group's cultural identity, should you limit the size of minority groups within it? Today, we'll discuss a particularly sensitive case. Admissions at elite universities in the United States. For those of Asian descent, this topic may hit close to home, but I urge you to stay calm. We're here to explore ideas and methods, not to stir emotions. It seems that elite U.S. universities discriminate against Asian students. For instance, as an Asian American born and raised in the U.S., you often need significantly higher test scores than white students, especially black students, to have a chance of being admitted to Harvard. And sometimes even stellar scores aren't enough. In 2023, a shocking case made headlines. A Chinese-American student, named Jon Wang, scored 1590 on the SAT, just 10 points shy of a perfect score, had the highest GPA in his high school class, engaged in numerous extracurricular activities, and even founded his own company. Despite his extraordinary achievements, Jon applied to 9 top-tier universities, and was rejected by all of them. Jon didn't quietly accept this outcome. Instead, he joined forces with an organization called Students for Fair Admissions, SFFA, and sued Harvard University. The lawsuit went all the way to the Supreme Court, where Harvard ultimately lost. The Supreme Court's ruling explicitly prohibited universities from considering race as a factor in admissions moving forward. This decision effectively overturned affirmative action policies. Previously, universities had given preferential treatment to black students, essentially admitting them with lower scores, as a form of compensation for historical oppression. Now that this form of compensation is no longer legally permissible, Asian students are expected to receive fairer treatment. So, does this mean Harvard will now base admissions solely on academic performance and dramatically increase the proportion of Asian students? Not likely. Let's look at the data. Here's a chart showing the racial composition of Harvard's undergraduate population in recent years. White students make up 43.5%, Asian students make up 17.1%, black students make up only 6.7%. Another chart, for the 2022 to 2023 academic year, shows slight variations, but one thing remains clear. White students are overwhelmingly represented, Asians rank second, and black representation is minimal. These data reveal 2 key points. First, the proportion of Asians at Harvard, and at other top-tier universities, is not particularly low. Asians make up only 6% of the U.S. population, yet their representation at elite universities often exceeds 20% or more. Although Harvard did not admit Jon, it still admitted a significant number of Asian students. Of course, one might argue that Asians, being especially diligent in academics, naturally belong at top schools. But this percentage hardly suggests extreme discrimination. Second, the lack of Asian admissions isn't the fault of black students. Their representation is already small. Even without affirmative action, cutting black student numbers in half wouldn't significantly increase opportunities for Asians. Malcolm Gladwell strongly implies that targeting African Americans is misdirected. The fight for spots should be directed at white applicants instead. I fully support Jon Wang in fighting for his rights, and those of other Asian Americans. However, it's also crucial to understand Harvard's admissions logic. If you were the president of Harvard, how would you approach this issue? Let's reframe the question for greater relatability. Imagine it's the year 2050, and China has become a developed nation, attracting immigrants from around the world. These immigrants work diligently, alleviating the challenges of an aging population. Particularly noteworthy are Nigerian youth, who excel academically, and rank among the top performers in provincial entrance exams, with many gaining admission to Peking University. This scenario isn't far-fetched. Fun fact. Among immigrants in the U.S., Nigerians have the highest proportion of advanced degrees. 17% hold master's degrees, and 4% have PhDs, surpassing both whites and Asians. By 2050, Nigerians comprise 20% of Peking University's incoming class. As the university president, you recall the magic third rule and wonder. If Nigerians continue to increase in number, can Peking University still claim to be a bastion of Chinese culture? Nigerians pay taxes and contribute to China's development. But Peking University, steeped in the legacy of thinkers like Lu Xun and Hu Shi, has a cultural mission. Shouldn't the Nigerian proportion be capped to safeguard this mission? You can't outright impose higher admission standards for Nigerians. That wouldn't align with the spirit of fairness in a great nation. So, how would you handle it? The experiences of Harvard's president 100 years ago may offer insights. Originally, Ivy League universities, including Harvard, were places for the children of white elites to attend. As we discussed earlier, the drawbacks of a monocultural educational system were recognized, and these universities realized that it wasn't ideal to only have children from wealthy families. They needed to open up and attract talent from all parts of society. So, starting in the late 19th century, Ivy League schools gradually raised their admission standards over several decades, placing more emphasis on academic performance, rather than family background. By the 1920s, admissions were primarily based on test scores. Around this time, many Jewish immigrants arrived in the United States. These Jews, having just arrived with little wealth, were from lower middle-class backgrounds, with some even living in New York slums. However, their children worked hard in their studies. To use a Chinese phrase, they were essentially test takers. Jewish students quickly entered top American universities. By the early 20th century, 40% of the new students at Columbia University were Jewish. By 1922, the proportion of Jewish students at Harvard had exceeded 20%. At the time, Harvard's president, Abbott Lawrence Lowell, saw this as problematic. It wasn't that Jewish students were performing poorly academically, nor was the president personally discriminating against Jews. The issue was that, as more Jewish students enrolled, white elites would stop coming. This would change the entire culture and atmosphere of the school. The president believed the proportion of Jewish students should be controlled to around 15%. Too few would be considered discriminatory, while too many would cross a critical threshold. But you couldn't make it too obvious, so what did he do? Lowell's solution was to consider a student's overall quality. It wasn't just about test scores. It also mattered what extracurricular activities they participated in, whether their application essays were compelling, and if their parents had influential friends who could write recommendation letters. These factors were highly subjective and gave the admissions team a lot of discretion. Clearly, children from elite white families had a better chance of excelling in these areas. This child may not have the best math scores, but they are full of love and responsibility. Surely they will achieve great things. Many years have passed, and the Jewish students who once faced discrimination have now become the new elites. Perhaps they could even be considered white enough, and Harvard no longer sets barriers against Jewish students, with Jewish leaders even becoming presidents of the university. Now, the exceptionally talented but not yet elite new immigrants are Asians. Or more strictly, to use Gladwell's words, the only racial group whose proportion can exceed the critical threshold is white people. Not all top schools behave this way, though. The California Institute of Technology, Caltech, while not part of the Ivy League, is also a top school and does not consider subjective factors in admissions, focusing solely on academic performance. As a result, the proportion of Asian students there has surpassed 45%, ranking first among all races. Harvard likely doesn't want to follow this model. In the modern era, Harvard created a special subjective admissions channel, known as ALDC, which stands for Athletes, Legacies, Children of Alumni, Dean's Interest List, in effect, Children of the Wealthy, and Children of Faculty. Harvard gives these students preferential treatment in admissions, lowering their standards, and ALDC comprises 30% of the student body. One can imagine that many individuals in ALDC wouldn't meet Harvard's usual admissions criteria. How many are there? Someone made a specific statistical analysis. The vast majority of them are white, far exceeding the proportion of white students in the overall student body. The most open aspect of ALDC is athletes. If you don't understand the logic of ALDC, you won't understand why Harvard goes to such great lengths to recruit athletes from around the world, many of whom compete in niche sports, like rowing, squash, or women's rugby, with very little public attention. Harvard's president might say that recruiting athletes strengthens the community and boosts morale, but that's all nonsense. The real reason is that becoming an athlete is very expensive. The U.S. doesn't have a state-run sports system, so aspiring athletes must pay for private coaching, therapy, physical training, and equipment. This adds up to a large sum. On top of that, a parent must have the time to take the child across the country for competitions. The cost is high, and even then, the chances of achieving Olympic-level results are extremely low, since there are so few natural sports talents in the world. Because this activity is so costly and of little practical use, it is highly valued by Harvard. Think about it. What kind of family would invest so much in their child's sports pursuits? Clearly, it's the white elite families. Now we understand that the Ivy League universities have these complicated admissions practices to ensure that children from white elite families form the overwhelming majority. Claims that extracurricular activities reflect character, or that sports build character, are just excuses. So, let's say there's an Asian family. Average middle class, working hard to get their child into an Ivy League school. They see all these admission requirements and think, no problem. If you want academic performance, I'll boost the grades. If you want extracurricular activities, I'll work on that. If it's about music or sports, I'll have my child learn piano and fencing. This should work, right? The answer is most likely no. The rules are specifically designed to exclude you. If you're admitted, it means the rules aren't strict enough. In short, to climb the Ivy League, improving your scores is not enough. Almost every Asian middle-class family has their child learn an instrument. This is not a unique advantage. Randomly practicing some sports won't cut it, either. It's not enough to be just good. Simply put, either you have extraordinary innate talent, or your parents are very powerful. If neither applies, then you'd better be white. Does this count as racial discrimination? Maybe Harvard has the right to preserve its own culture, and maybe all races should be treated equally. This question is subjective, and is not the focus of our discussion here. What we are concerned with is social engineering. In fact, Chinese history has been full of ALDC-like phenomena, though not in university admissions, but in the selection of officials. Whenever a minority group took over the Central Plains, there would always be the issue of whether to Hanifei. For example, during the Northern Wei period of the Northern and Southern dynasties, they believed that Han culture was advanced, and the Xianbei emperor ordered the Xianbei people to voluntarily adopt Han culture. But soon, the Xianbei nobles pushed back, questioning whether they should abandon their own traditions. During the Northern Song period, the Liao kingdom adopted a strategy of separating governance into southern and northern regions, with the southern area governed in the Han way, and the northern area retaining the Khitan tradition. However, when the proportion of Han officials in the central government exceeded a critical point, Liao culture began to increasingly adopt Han ways. Later, the Jin dynasty rose from the north, originally made up of the Jurchens, but when their territory expanded into Han areas, they faced the issue of Hanification. These regimes were cautious about Hanification not just for identity reasons, but because adopting Confucianism was seen as a way to strengthen governance and improve control over the people, thus stabilizing the regime. The downside was that military power would decline, and the empire's drive to expand would weaken. Historical experience shows that, once a minority regime undergoes Hanification, it loses its aggressive edge, and before long, it is conquered by another more barbaric minority group. Even the Manchu Eight Banners lost their fighting ability after living in Han areas for too long. But the Manchu people had two trump cards. One was the Mongols, whom they only allied with through marriage, rather than direct rule, preserving their distance from Han culture, while still maintaining military strength when needed. The other, less known, was the Solon people in Heilongjiang, what we now call the Dor, Evenki, and Orichan tribes, who were excellent fighters but stayed in the borderlands, avoiding Han culture, and remaining poor to maintain their combat readiness. This is why, even in the later Qing dynasty, they were still so strong in the highlands, in Xinjiang, and against the Russian Empire. Mongols and Solon people played a crucial role. Finally, I want to remind you again. What we are discussing today is simply an objective law, what will happen, not what should happen. That's it for today's content. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.
If you feel there is value in this, please like, subscribe to this channel, and leave your thoughts or suggestions in the comments section. Let's grow together and read more good books.